Okay, great. Thanks.
Hello,
We are live.
everyone. We are on, right, Carissa?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. This is Marisa Viana. I'm with Research, and I'll be moderating the session today on bodies and territory. We just start running a little bit late, but we are starting now. So hopefully everyone is connected. And today this is a two-part webinar series, which is connected to the umbrella session on the body integrity and freedom, which will take place at the AWID Forum in Brazil in the coming month in September. And the theme of this session aims to explore the evolution of the body from physical to identity and experiences and struggles, as well as the backlash that we have in our activism and advocacy we have seen on the body, and how feminist activists from around the world are reclaiming the body in its possibilities and expressions. So as I said, this is the two webinar parts. So today we're going to focus on the convergence and divergences of bodies and territories, and speak a little bit of the struggles for integrity and freedoms, as well as how it relates to the body, sexuality, and the questions around territory. We just a couple of logistics. We have one in the social media. We have 3 hashtags that we're using today. The first one is hashtag body and territory. The second one is my body, my freedom. And then the third one is bodily freedoms. And then also we have the hashtag AWID Forum. And we are hoping to carry this hashtag through this webinar, and then to the next one, and then hopefully to the AWID Forum as well, so that we can create discussions and momentum around this topic. If you want to ask a question, you'll see on your screen the Q&A button, so you must press that to ask a question. And I'll just do a brief introduction of the speakers today. We have with us Sheena Mangenya. Sorry, Sheena, if I'm butchering your name. She's from Kenya, and she's a media specialist with the Coalition of African Lesbians, and is based in Nairobi. The Coalition of African Lesbians is one of the organizers of this session, and also the AWID umbrella session on bodily integrity and freedoms. Sheena is passionate about conversations around the bodies of African women, the politics that limits our full autonomy and personhood, and affect the daily lives of women and girls. We also have Hiwa Sayed from Lebanon, and Hiwa is an anarch-feminist activist, researcher, writer, and editor. She's based in Beirut, Lebanon, and she has been involved in queer and feminist spaces since 2009. She was the founder and editor of Kohal, a journal for body and gender research that, if you haven't checked out yet, you should. It's a multilingual open access and peer-reviewed journal that aims to respond to the cultural and orientalist hegemonies of research around gender and sexuality from the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and North Africa regions. She's in the advisory committee of FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, and she's also a member of research realizing sexual and reproductive justice. And we also have Shi Alarcon from Costa Rica, and she'll be doing her presentation and speaking to us in Spanish, and Lina from AWID is going to be translating. So we'll have a little bit more time there. And she's a young feminist researcher with extensive experience in Costa Rica in the areas of human rights, land rights and territories, sexualities, inequalities, justice, and advocacy. She has worked with various groups and institutions in Central America, developing research and methodology training from a human rights perspective. She's a graduate in sociology from the University of Costa Rica. She's also a member of a collective in Latin America called the Vecinas Feministas for sexual and reproductive justice in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we'll start with Sheena, and I'll be asking each of the participants the same question, because we want to hear from your context and your regions around the discussions around body integrity and freedoms. And we'll give you each one of you 5 minutes for the first question. Then we'll see if the participants have other questions they want to raise before we move to the next questions. So the first question, Sheena, that I would like to pose for this discussion, it's around the the concept of bodily integrity and freedom and how it's understood in your context or region, and where does the body and territory converge or diverge in the conceptualization of bodily integrity and freedom. And if you can speak a little bit from your experience and your work on this question, so that we can start the discussion today.
Thank you, Marisa. In thinking about and talking about bodily integrity and bodily autonomy and freedom, and in the context in which I live and work, which my immediate context is Kenya, and then I guess a geopolitical context is Africa, it's this almost feels like a very, for lack of a better way of saying it, feels like a very privileged conversation, because the language of bodily integrity and autonomy is so out of reach. It almost seems like such a utopian construction, because of how I feel civil society has been structured to work by way of trading or negotiating certain born rights and liberties and freedoms with what the law says, and heteropatriarchy and what we're always trying to trade off. So the idea of bodily integrity is something that is taken away from, and territory, it's taken away from us very systematically, very deliberately, very almost calculatingly, and by different social structures that we exist within. So I think the first unit would be the family, and the family is a unit that is endorsed or encouraged by the church. And so the church says that the family has to be formed in X and Y way, XYZ way, and therefore for you to fit in a family, you have to either be a girl or be a boy. So anything that's in between doesn't have a place in the family. So the family unit, I think, is the very first site of corrupting what I think is our bodily integrity. And it might be a dangerous statement to make, but that's how it's policed by things like religion and things like social cultural practices, things like the law. And from that kind of interaction we have with our families, we take this out into the wider world, right? So there's the intrapersonal relationship we have with our bodies as territories, and learning very early, and especially girls, and to an extent boys, very early, that our bodies are not our territories. Our bodies are occupied territories, occupied by our family, occupied by our tribes and our cultures, and occupied by the state, and occupied by society, where they tell us how our bodies should look, how we should dress our bodies. In some cultures, how we should feed our bodies, where you have cultures that feed boys better than girls because of patriarchy, basically, that says boys are better than girls, and therefore we have to invest more and better in the boy child. And then we take that into the wider world, where we're told that as people who are occupying the body territory of women, this is what's expected of you. You're supposed to go here at this time, at that place, behave in this way. You're supposed to articulate things in a particular way, or not at all. That your power as a woman is in your silence. So we're told, be quiet, things like that. So this is the context within which I find myself trying to understand the idea of what bodily integrity is. If you've never known that your body is yours, it becomes something that's hard for you to defend. It becomes something that's hard for you to own. It becomes something that's impossible for you to sometimes control. And that's why society says, because you cannot own and control yourself, we are going to help you control your body and control how you are in the world, and help police and protect you, as mostly people in women's bodies or people occupying feminine bodies are subjected to all kinds of such restrictions. So it feels very out of reach. the idea of bodily integrity, and there needs to be more conversations that place it in a way that we can really understand, and it stops being this idea that is so unattainable, because the truth is we are born into our full bodily integrity in how we express ourselves. If you watch children, how we express ourselves, how we feel, how we allow ourselves to be so fully present in our bodies and in owning our bodies as territories, which is taken away from us as we get older. But yeah, I think my time is up. That's me.
Thank you, Sheena. That's a great way to start, and I would just move to Hiwa first, and then we can have a bit of a conversation. But Hiwa, so if I can ask you the same question around the sort of what is the context in terms of your region and your work on the concept of bodily integrity and freedoms, and how is that understood for you, and where do you see divergence and convergence of bodies and territory when we talk about bodily integrity and freedom?
Thank you, Marisa. So in my context, which is like the Middle East and North Africa, what we can see now is an increased restriction, policing, and control of borders and mobility in general. And this comes as a cause and response to what we all know, or what we are told is the refugee crisis. Of course, this does not mean that before there weren't any restrictions in terms of, mobility and bodily integrity. But when we look at the geopolitical borders and shifting landscapes, we can see that they particularly affect migrant bodies and entire communities. And if we look at the way these communities have been portrayed and perceived, then we see that they are mostly labeled as terrorists. And so mobility comes here as restricted to deny them access to certain territories. And this pushes trafficking and undocumented violence further underground. And despite centuries of occupation and colonialism, certain bodies from certain places in the world are treated as disposable. And I'm not saying that to make an apologetic claim. I mean, there is terrorism in the MENA that is homegrown and local, and it is, of course, based on religious fundamentalism. But when we look at resistance movements that intersect with bodily integrity and sexual dissent, and in relation to land, they have also been dismissed largely as terrorist. And for example, I'm taking the example of the Palestinian struggle, especially in relation to queer women and feminists. And also, for example, the Kurdish conflict with women fighters. So in such frameworks, when we look at sexual nonconformity and dissent, we see that they are repressed in favor of hetero and homonormative systems of being in the status quo. So if we want to look, for example, at Palestine, then we would see that one way to restrict bodily integrity is homonationalism and pinkwashing. And these notions come as, whitewashing crimes in favor of a progressive image of the state of Israel, while the treatment of Palestinians, whether queer or not, remains the same. So it doesn't matter whether they are queer Palestinians or homonormative or heteronormative Palestinians, they are still seen as the same bodies to be repressed. So to put it simply, if we look at homonationalism, it is much more complex than that, but in that context, it is deeming certain queer bodies as less worthy. So in my context, in the context of Lebanon, where I live, we can also see new facets of homonationalism that did not exist before. And so when we look, if we want to expand on the term and look at homonationalism from the perspective of the Syrian refugee crisis, what we see here is a kind of victimization of the Syrian gay body, and as a consequence to that, the Lebanese middle class gay body becomes the more worthy homosexual body in the eyes of the state. And so forced migrants and refugees can suddenly become queer bodies, not necessarily in their sexual orientation, but in the way they transgress borders and the status quo that intersect with other forms of oppression. And this creates a state of homonationalism in the way we look at refugees in general, at migration and at mobility. So if we link sexual dissent with the politics of disposability, we cannot but look at bodily integrity and territory in general. So in terms of like forced migrations and expulsions in the region, we can see that human trafficking is becoming largely undocumented. It leads to forced sex work. Like just 2 months ago, there was a sex trafficking ring that was dismantled, and it was mainly Syrian women that were trafficked across the border to Lebanon. We can also see forced early marriages. So young Syrian girls are being sold either by trafficking rings or by their own families because they feel that this would allow them like a decent life instead of living in tents. And we see other instances of violation of bodily freedom and integrity, such as the organ black market. And of course, this feeds into the commodification of bodies in general in trade and reinforces liberal market economies. So trafficking does not only happen in the region. It is a flux that happens within and without. So when we look at trafficking in terms of bodily integrity, we also see trafficking to move bodies across borders and seas. As refugees who want to flee their war-torn contexts and go to other places such as Turkey or Europe. So what we are faced with here are bodies that are forcibly removed from their land, bodies that are disposable and queer, and ultimately have nowhere to go. So I think my time is up for now.
Thanks, Yua. This is really some really good points. I've been trying to take some main points from what you guys are speaking so we can come back to it in a little bit. But so maybe we should move to she, and Lina, would you be able to translate the question for she?
Sí, claro. She, ¿me escuchas? Sorry, yeah, I'm going to translate the question to she. She, ¿estás ahí? She?
She, ¿nos puede escuchar?
She, ¿nos estás escuchando? She's connected through her cell phone, so we might be having some technical difficulties. She, ¿estás ahí? She, si estás hablando en este momento no te podemos escuchar. Tal vez tienes el teléfono en silencio.
I just sent her a message as well to check if her connectivity is on, because she's in a remote area in Costa Rica, so it's hard to get the connection. And we're really looking forward to hear from she, because she works directly in indigenous territories in Costa Rica, and I think it would be like a great link to hear from her and how that experience is happening in Latin America, and more specifically around indigenous territories and the extractivist industries. So hopefully she can connect. So let us try again. She, ¿nos puede escuchar? Okay, so it seems that she was muted, it seems. Okay, so can people hear me now? I think I was muted before. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I was just saying that we really wanted to hear from she, and so hopefully she can reconnect, but it seems now she was, her connection stopped. So one of the perspectives that she was going to bring to the discussion is working in indigenous territories in Latin America, and the links there with the extractivist industries and what it means for bodies and territories when the territory, it's someone's home and it's all their livelihood. So hopefully she's able to reconnect with us so that we can pick up on this discussion. Perhaps if there are other questions from the audience that we can raise now, or any comments before we move on to the next question. So I'm just doing a screening of the chat, so give me 1 second. Oh, she is this. ¿She nos escucha ahora?
Sí, te escucho.
Ok. Bien.
Gracias.
¿Me escuchas?
Sí, ahora sí.
Ya te escuchamos. Bueno, Shi, te voy a hacer la pregunta que le hemos preguntado a las otras presentadoras. ¿Me escuchas bien? Shi, ¿me puedes escuchar? Marisa, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. I'm not sure if he was disconnected.
Yeah. Shi, are you there? Shi, ¿estás ahí? I believe she got disconnected again. Shi?
Also, just a reminder for everybody, the participants on the Google Hangouts, that if you want to ask a question, you need to press the Q&A button on the left-hand side of the screen. So you press on the button, that way you can ask a question or make a comment.
Hola, Shi, ¿nos escuchas? Shi?
Okay, well, I think just in terms of trying to make use of the time, and hopefully she will reconnect again, I was going to move on and perhaps picking up on both Sheena's and he was the points they already raised around the tactics that repressive actors have been using and use for to repress the body and sort of to curb and what is the linkage there with religious fundamentalism. And I was saying earlier with the examples that she would have to share around the extractive industry for us to have a further conversation around what are the actual tactics that repressive actors have been using to limit the advances of bodily integrity and freedom, but also to advance their exploitation of bodies and territories. Sheena, would you want to get us started?
Sure. Yeah. So something I think that's worth mentioning is what we think, especially at Cal, is the intimate interdependence between bodily integrity, safety and security, freedom, movement is such an intimate interdependence of all those different factors, in that you cannot have your bodily integrity but have your movement restricted. As an example, you can't have you can't have safety and security but you don't have your bodily integrity guaranteed. So bodily integrity offers such an important entry point in ensuring that we actually have our freedom, we have our movement, we have our bodily autonomy, we have our safety and our security. Hence why all these factors kind of marry into each other. So I feel that a tactic that might not have started off as a tactic in the beginning to prevent um, this kind of progress is the separation of all these things, where we have groups, we have some movements that tell you that these things are separate. They tell you that bodily integrity needs to be something that's discussed there by them. Issues of sexual orientation and gender identity need to be discussed separately. Issues of violence need to be discussed separately. And the separation of the issues that are so intricately interlinked, I feel, is one of the very first failing points in terms of, or one of the very first tactics where sometimes states, sometimes other organizations, sometimes patriarchy in its many different manifestations tells you that that is not your problem. If your problem is violence, then issues of the environment are not your problem. Things like that. So I feel like that is a very, very, very big issue in that particular way of looking at things. But also, I'm sorry, maybe someone else can speak. I have company. Please excuse me. But I feel like I said something important. 1 second. I apologize.
Thank you, Sheena. Hiwa, are you still with us?
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can pick up on that question also, just elaborate. You already spoke a little bit about the tactics that are being employed around sort of homo-nationalism and the pinkwashing and sort of the restrictions of mobility. But I was wondering if you can go a bit further into the tactics that the repressive actors have used to advance their exploitation, repression of the body and territory.
Yes. So of course, I mean, I already talked a bit about trafficking, which is also like a major tactic that is being used. But to go back to the basics a bit, it is in the way the society is constructed as such that makes it kind of difficult for certain actors to enjoy their full bodily integrity and rights. And this is not to give a homogeneous view of how society is, but in terms of the way certain laws are being performed and applied, what we see is a response that is intricately linked to a certain type of religious fundamentalism, not in its entirety, but certain laws are definitely applied as religious laws, at least in the context of Lebanon. So what we see is, in general, a kind of crackdown on certain freedoms in Lebanon, and in other contexts such as Syria and Iraq, what we see is like downright terror and war that is being unleashed on like entire populations, and this is where the forced migration and expulsion happens, because those bodies are made are made unsafe in their own territory. But if we want to look at it in terms of general tactics, then we can look at the privatization and neoliberalism and the policies that they have implemented on the region. So when there is a whole region that is like being exploited in terms not only of the land but also labor and the working class, then what we can see is a highly impoverished population in contrast to a very small minority that monopolizes all the resources. And this is also ironically translated on the civil society as well, where we can see whole organizations that mobilize and that monopolize all the resources, while smaller ones are always kept on the margins. But to go back to the populations in general, what we are or what the status quo is giving those populations is a complete lack of alternative. And this is the major weapon, in my opinion, of religious fundamentalism, whether in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey, or in Palestine. And it is the idea that, you know, religious fundamentalism and its like groups are able to give an alternative to these populations, no matter how skewed, no matter how extremist it is. And so the question remains, what are we doing as advocates of integrity and autonomy to offer the alternative to the alternative for these communities?
Thank you, Liwa. We're going to try to erase some really important points, and we're still trying to get She's input, and seems she was able to reconnect. So we're going to try to get her now, and then we'll come back to these same questions again. She, ¿nos puede escuchar?
Sí, te puedo escuchar.
Ok, muy bien. Entonces, vamos a intentar hacer la primera pregunta de antes para ver si podemos escuchar bien. Dina, ¿me puedes ayudar con la traducción?
Bueno, mira, la primera pregunta es si nos puedes hablar cómo el concepto de libertad e integridad del cuerpo, cómo lo entiendes en tu contexto o en tu región, y dónde crees que hay divergencias de este concepto en la manera en que conceptualizas las libertades y la integridad del cuerpo.
Ok. Bueno, hola. Creo que para mí la integridad del cuerpo, o lo que es el cuerpo, el territorio cuerpo, no va a ser el mismo, porque trabajo en un territorio indígena y eso me hace pensar el cuerpo más allá de una opción o de que los cuerpos de las mujeres tienen libertad para elegir.
Okay, what she's saying is that when she thinks about bodily integrity and freedoms, it's not the same as for the mainstream, because she works with indigenous territories, so they perceive the reality in a different way. Okay, ¿She puede seguir hablando?
Generalmente los cuerpos de las mujeres o la defensa de los cuerpos de las mujeres está en función de temas de aborto, derechos sexuales y derechos reproductivos. Y la desvalorización de los cuerpos de las mujeres va en esa misma línea.
Okay, so she says that when it comes to women's bodies, the way that the thematics that they focus on are things like abortion or reproductive rights, more on kind of those lines. Okay, ¿She puede seguir?
Sin embargo, cuando planteamos el cuerpo como en similitud al territorio tierra y hablamos del territorio cuerpo como un espacio para la lucha y la defensa del territorio, podemos cambiar el paradigma sobre qué es la libertad y qué es el cuerpo, por tanto.
Okay, so she says that once you look at the body, and if you compare that to the territory, then you can start using a different narrative and change the paradigm. So you can use the bodies as equal as you use the language of the territory. Okay, She puede seguir.
En Centroamérica se habla de la colonización de la tierra o del proceso de colonización que sufrimos en América, pero olvidamos que el primer espacio colonizado fueron los cuerpos.
Okay, she says that in Central America, for example, when we talk about colonization, we focus too much on colonization of space and territory, but we forget about the colonization of the bodies. Okay,
y por tanto, el cuerpo tiene que ser el primer espacio liberado, y en ese sentido el cuerpo de las mujeres tiene que ser el primero.
So that's why when it comes to the body, they see that that's the first territory that needs to be liberated, particularly women's bodies.
Y a las feministas de Costa Rica al menos nos ha costado entender que para que las mujeres puedan romper con los círculos de violencia en sus cuerpos, necesitamos incluir la lucha por la defensa del territorio, tierra, para lograr luchar por otros derechos.
Ok, ¿me podrías repetir esa parte, por favor? Que en Costa Rica
Digamos,
las feministas.
en Costa Rica las feministas tenemos dificultad para poder sumar a la gente, digamos, para romper el círculo de violencia que sufren los cuerpos de las mujeres o de las niñas o de las adolescentes, si no incluimos la defensa de la tierra también dentro de las demandas que tenemos.
Okay, she says that in Costa Rica they have found difficulties trying to bring feminists to understand that if they want to break the circle of violence against uh, girls and women and their bodies, they need to integrate into their struggles also the protection and defense and the protection of their territories as well. Okay,
Entonces, nos enfrentamos como a dos grandes oposiciones. Por un lado, los sectores conservadores y Costa Rica como país católico que, digamos, oprime los derechos sexuales y los reproductivos, y por otro lado, el sector capitalista empresarial que quiere las tierras de los indígenas, de las mujeres, de los campesinos.
Okay, so in her particular context, they face two different challenges. One is the very conservative and Catholic kind of environment that oppresses particularly reproductive rights and the rights of women, but also the corporate sector and how they're invading their territories and extracting their resources.
Lina, it's Marisa.
Yeah?
I was wondering if you can also just add then to ask she to add sort of what are the tactics that these two sectors are using to further repress the body, so that we try to merge the two questions as well.
Ok, sí, la pregunta que te están haciendo es que si puedes explicarnos qué tácticas están usando estos dos sectores, el católico, el conservador, y el sector de las empresas extractivas. ¿Cuáles son las tácticas que están usando?
Ajá. La iglesia católica ahorita no está teniendo un perfil alto porque las iglesias evangélicas hacen el trabajo sucio porque están en el Congreso.
Okay, so the first sector that she was talking about, in terms of the church, she says that the Catholic Church is actually playing a very low profile at the moment. The ones that are doing the dirty work are the evangelicals. Yeah, ¿puedes seguir, sí, por favor? Sí.
Ok, y las empresas extractivistas lo que están haciendo es que hacen un proceso legal para poder comprar las tierras. El Estado en algún momento se las vendió y ahora los indígenas están tratando de recuperarlas, pero por medio de procesos legales ellos son los dueños ilegales de la tierra.
Okay, when it comes to the corporations, there have been kind of a legal process that the government has sold the territories to these corporations, but they have been in the for the indigenous populations, it's actually, they see that as an illegal process because they weren't consulted and the land was just stolen from them. Marisa, do you want me to ask you more specifically about the tactics, or you think that, so is this too broad?
Yeah, I think that's a good start. Perhaps you just can elaborate a little bit more on the question that we were asking the other speakers as well, just in terms of it's this similar approach of sort of taking extractions of the land and the resources, and at the same time sort of the fundamentalism and in situation in Central America around the Catholic Church and the power that they influence, but also the sort of the I'm trying to phrase in a way that is easier to answer the question, but in terms of the actual sort of how present and how these two actors that she has named have continued to advance and exploit, and I think she answered this question somehow, but I don't know if she would like to elaborate more or with other examples that she wants to share.
Ok, sí, lo que te está preguntando Marisa es si quieres elaborar un poco más en las tácticas que estabas hablando de los evangelistas y de las corporaciones, como profundizar un poco más de específicamente. Sí,
Ok,
no te estoy escuchando en este momento si estás hablando.
¿Sí nos escucha?
Sí.
I think it's because I was interested to hear more from she on this, just because in the case of many Latin Americans, in my country included, which is Brazil, where many of the evangelicals and fundamentalists are actually in parliament and they're actually in Congress and they are the ones making the decisions. They are in a position of power and decision making that, sort of both in passing legislations and laws that restrict the bodies, anything from abortion to talking about gender in schools to for example, the case that she is saying that government selling the lands that have traditionally belonged to indigenous communities, and that once that is sold, to private corporations, they are the legally owner, and so they lose their territory, they lose their autonomy, they lose sort of the mobility because they can't even cross the border to the lands that they traditionally belongs to them. And so I just wanted to hear from she. I don't know if she'll be able to reconnect, but in terms of that sort of, if I'm assuming it's a similar situation in terms of the legality of these actors within governments and within legal frameworks that they use to further exploit the bodies and territories. She, are you back?
sí, estoy de vuelta.
Sí, muy
Sí,
bien.
estoy acá.
Ok. Es que estaba preguntando un poquito más de cómo podemos hablar de, bueno, estaba dando un poco de ejemplo de Brasil, donde los evangélicos y los fundamentalistas están totalmente adentro de un parámetro legal, donde están en posiciones de poder y de decisión, y,
Ujú.
y por eso pueden hacer este tipo de cosas, de como vender las tierras y cambiar las políticas y todo eso, y quería saber un poco más de ti sobre cómo está
Claro.
en Costa Rica.
Ok, sí, ¿puedes responder la
La
pregunta?
tierra son las mujeres. ¿Aló?
Oye, te cortaste un poco al principio, ¿puedes volver a empezar, por favor?
Claro. Y las mujeres son las que están defendiendo la tierra o dirigiendo este proceso de recuperación de tierras que está en manos de las corporaciones. Entonces, por un lado, los sectores conservadores fundamentalistas atacan sus cuerpos desde que son mujeres liberadas, en el sentido negativo, como abortan y toda esta cosa. Y por otro lado, las corporaciones amenazan a sus hijos y además violentan sus cuerpos sexualmente.
Okay, so she says that when it comes to women are actually the ones that are defending the land from the corporate hands. Um, yeah, and from like sectors like the fundamentalist sectors and the conservative supporters to the corporate power. And she says that when it comes to oh yeah, and also when it comes to corporations, they're the ones that are being raped and like their bodies are being violated. So not even them, not just them, but also their children. Sí, pero podrías profundizar un poco más en lo que te estaba preguntando Marisa si los
¿Me repites,
evangélicos,
por favor?
sí, por ejemplo, si los evangélicos son parte del gobierno y cómo usan esas tácticas para ejercer poder.
¿Me repetís la pregunta? Es que se corta.
Sí, Marisa estaba tratando de profundizar más en cuanto a cuando los evangélicos, que decías que son parte del Parlamento o se infiltran en el Parlamento o en el gobierno en Costa Rica, y
Ujú.
cómo usan eso para extender su poder.
Claro, en Costa Rica no es un problema tener partidos evangélicos para optar por puestos de decisión. Entonces, al ser Costa Rica un país tan pequeño, con 20.000 votos, vos podés salir electo para diputado del Congreso. Y ellos lo que están haciendo es montando su agenda, negocian con los sectores que tienen más dinero para que no pase la agenda provida y ellos tampoco.
Okay. Okay, so she says that in Costa Rica, there is not really a problem for the evangelicals to get to the government because there is not necessarily it's they don't need to be part of a political party. Only because the country is so small, you only need 20,000 votes to become part of to be a congressperson or be part of the Congress. So for them, it's very easy to move the agenda of a pro-life in that sense. Ok, sí, ya puedes seguir hablando. ¿Sí?
Well, perhaps this actually there's a question from the audience that we can raise, and that connects to what she's speaking as well. And it would be great to hear back from Sheena and Hiwa as well. And the question that's coming from Putri Kunyati. Sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly. And the question it's around the correlation of fundamentalism's embodied patriarchy. And she's given this example that I think that has happening in her country mostly is that body patriarchy believed as the way to keep women's bodies safe is supported by religious value. And what do you guys, what the speakers think about this? And for when there's a good time, with this question of body patriarchy or using this approach to keep women's bodies safe. Does anyone want to take that question? And perhaps she is coming. We can translate it to Alina can translate to she, and then perhaps Sheena and Hiwa can start.
Sí, ¿quieres que te traduzca la pregunta que está haciendo la audiencia en este momento? ¿Nos escuchas?
Por favor. Sí, te escucho, por
Sí,
favor.
Ok, la pregunta es, ¿cómo es la correlación entre los fundamentalismos y como el patriarcado cuando viene en relación con el cuerpo de las mujeres más que todo? Y en cuanto a la seguridad del cuerpo de la mujer, si crees que si todo esto está siendo apoyado por los grupos religiosos fundamentalistas.
Ok, creo que efectivamente hay una relación. Los grupos de derecha están dispuestos a negociar, digamos, de derecha, liberales, están dispuestos a negociar los derechos humanos con el sector fundamentalista para sostener el patriarcado y que así ninguno de los dos grupos pierda sus privilegios. Y esos privilegios son que no avance la agenda de derechos humanos, derechos sexuales y reproductivos, y que por otro lado no existan procesos para la recuperación de tierra o la protección de los cuerpos de las mujeres. ¿Aló?
Gracias,
Aló.
She.
Ya, okay. Pero sí, tú dices que sí existe una relación. Por un lado son los grupos de la derecha que están que se unen con el patriarcado para obstaculizar los derechos humanos.
Ajá.
Y que por ejemplo, hacen que no avancen los derechos humanos y reproductivos y la protección de la tierra.
Exacto, porque es que en Costa Rica los grupos liberales se venden como defensores de los derechos humanos, pero ya en el Congreso lo que hacen es negociar esos derechos a cambio de sostener sus privilegios. ¿Me escuchas?
Sí, okay, so what she's saying is that there is definitely a relation between those two points. She says that the groups on the right, from the right, they use, because they, even though they're groups in the right, they claim to be liberals, so they use the narrative of human rights, but within a very patriarchal system. So, for example, they stop the advancement or the achievement of human rights and recovering the land for the indigenous territories, because they so it's kind of like they use that as a bargaining power. So they go to the different communities and they tell them that they're protecting their rights, but when they use that, when they go back to the government and parliament, they completely disregard the rights, reproductive rights, and the protection to the land, and they just stop all this process from happening, because in the end they're not necessarily going through a liberal process, but it's more like acting as groups from the right. I don't know if was that clear, Marisa?
Yes, that was good. I was thinking that we should see if we can hear from Sheena and then Hiwa before we go to other questions or other thoughts from the participants, and also perhaps we can start talking soon about some of the strategies, and she had mentioned some that I'll come back to it. But do you want to share some thoughts on this question? Sorry, Sheena. Sheena, can you hear me?
Huh?
Can you hear me, Sheena?
Gosh, sorry, I lost you there for a while. Sorry, can you please repeat that?
Yeah, so we had a question from the audience that's speaking a little bit to sort of the correlation and the linkages between the fundamentalisms and body patriarchy, and Poetry, who posed this question, is saying that in her country mostly is what has happened is that body patriarchy is believed to be a way to keep women's bodies safe. And it's supported by religious values. So sort of in terms of perhaps the cooptation of this approach to say that you keeping women safe, and in speaking about body patriarchy or the body patriarch, and just hearing some of your thoughts on the linkage between that in terms of safety of the body, fundamentalisms, and patriarchy. Were you able to hear me? Sheena, are you there? Well, can anyone hear me?
Yes, if you want, I can go next until Sheena can reconnect.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So basically, at least in my context, religious fundamentalism is based on an institution that is inherently patriarchal. And so in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa, the religion in general is not separated from the state. And so what happens then is that you have certain like sectarian bodies that are bodies, not as bodily integrity, but actors that are kind of controlling the morality of what is happening on the ground. And therefore, when we look at that, what we see is that women's bodies are further controlled because there is nothing safe about being treated as commodities, about being denied their freedom. And this reality that many of us live on a daily basis is not just based on laws alone, but also a whole system that functions intersectionally by linking together religious fundamentalism with creating moral panic, with a crackdown on women and queer bodies and refugee bodies as well.
Thanks, Hiwa. Sheena, are you back? So I think we lost Sheena. I see her, but it doesn't seem that she's connected. Or maybe she's connected now. Sheena? I think that's also, this question just reminded me a little bit also of the protectionist approach, the sort of when it's used, I think she mentioned a little bit of this as well, that's used to protect the body or protect, like when you talk about adolescents and young people in particular, when it comes to sexuality and access to information and so on, that you have this immediate that we face in many of our countries, sort of this backlash on what kind of information and services they can actually access, and it's sort of used under the disguise of like protecting them from bad information, for information that's going to corrupt their minds and the body. So it just it's definitely sort of a co-optation of keeping you safe or protecting you, but in reality it's just a disguised oppression. And in some ways you can also link that to sort of like early forced marriage and how some countries that have taken refugee are using that also in terms of protectionist measures. I am still trying to get Sheena back, but I think she has completely disconnected. So just to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, you need to press the Q&A button on the left side. You have to click on it so that you can ask a question. So you press on that, and then you can write up and submit your question that way. So maybe this would be a good time, perhaps, to just move into some of the she had raised some of these points around strategies of, like, if we really want to talk about bodies and territories, we need to both talk about land rights and sort of the body and sexuality and sexual and reproductive health and rights, as she was mentioning a little bit earlier. So maybe we can move into the question, and I hope she's still there and can hear us, and Hiwa as well. But in terms of now that we talked about the tactics the repressive actors have used, that we could perhaps talk about the strategies that are being used from different movements to actually reclaim the body in all its diversity, and the linking with the bridge building, to what kind of bridge building connections we need to make to advance greater solidarity, sort of, for reclaiming the body. So Hiwa, maybe we'll start with she, and then we'll go to Hiwa.
Ok, Shi, ¿nos puedes escuchar?
Sí, te escucho.
Mira, la pregunta que estamos haciendo ahora es en cuestión de las estrategias que están usando ustedes desde los movimientos para reclamar o para volver a reclamar sus cuerpos y en toda su diversidad, y qué tipo de como relaciones o vínculos están haciendo para avanzar la solidaridad y para hacer incidencia en cuanto a, o hacer vínculos con otros temas relacionados al respecto.
Claro, para trabajar el tema de derechos sexuales y reproductivos hemos tenido que incluir la lucha por la defensa del territorio. Digamos, eso es fundamental, sobre todo para las mujeres que trabajan en la tierra. Y a la inversa, la gente que lucha por derechos de la tierra, poner el cuerpo, sus cuerpos, digamos, también en ese proceso de defensa. Entonces, hablar de derechos sexuales y reproductivos, para poder como vincular ambas luchas.
¿Me puedes repetir la última parte? Sí, sí, lo que no te entendí muy bien es la última parte. Tú dices, dijiste, y la viceversa es que la gente que trabaja en derechos reproductivos y sexuales y reproductivos.
Claro, es que la gente que trabaja derechos sexuales y reproductivos está en la ciudad, dentro de luchar por la tierra. Entonces necesitamos hacer ese vínculo en ambos sentidos.
Ok.
Quienes luchan por derechos sexuales en la tierra también luchan por derechos sexuales.
Okay, so what she's saying is that in terms of strategies, what they're trying to do is to work with groups that work on the issues of sexual and reproductive rights and get them to incorporate the protection to the territory and the land as an essential strategy within their struggles, but also like do it convince the people that are working on the other like the other way around, also people that are or activists that are working on the protection of the land and territory, to also see how important it is to integrate the work on defending sexual and reproductive rights as well. So it goes both ways. Sí, podrías estar silenciador mientras no hablas por el sonido. Gracias. Yeah, Marisa, so is that okay to answer the question?
Yes, yeah, that was good. A good segue. She wants to add something else, or can we move slightly to see if we can get Sheena back? And we have some more questions from the participants as well. But I wanted to give a chance for she to ask her question, or to add if she needs to.
¿Tú quieres decir algo más al respecto? ¿Quieres profundizar más o esa es la respuesta que tienes?
No, quisiera decir dos cosas más. La primera es que ese vínculo interseccional tiene que ser necesariamente feminista. O sea, necesitamos llevar la discusión del feminismo a la lucha por la defensa del territorio, ¿verdad? Así como llevamos el proceso de la lucha intercultural donde las feministas. Y la segunda cosa es que entonces esta lucha se tiene que volver también antisistema, ¿verdad? Y esto quiere decir que, por ejemplo, en Costa Rica y creo que en Centroamérica necesitamos luchar contra el posicionamiento que tiene el sector fundamentalista para tomar las estructuras. En Costa Rica, la religión católica es parte de nuestra constitución. Entonces es como todo más difícil.
Okay.
¿Aló?
Yeah. So gracias, She. What she's saying is that she wants to say two things. That it's very important to establish the linkage or the intersectionality of the linkage between these two things that she's been talking about. And she says that there has to be a very strong focus, a feminist focus, especially when it comes to defending the territory and the intercultural struggles that they're trying to fight, or like that are part of their constant day-to-day struggles. But also, for them it's very important to make the point that everything has to be seen from a focus of like fighting the system. Because the problem in Costa Rica is that the fundamentalists, particularly the Catholic Church, is infiltrated in every single political decision that is made in the country. And for example, it's like even like the Catholic Church and is dialectic is incorporated in the constitution of the country. Marisa, you think this is okay, or should I ask her a little bit more?
No, this is great. Maybe we need to backtrack a little bit because we have a really interesting question which is connected to something that Hiwa said earlier, and it would be good to hear from She on it, which is on the issue of, is a question from Ala, is a question on politics of body disposability and commodification of bodies. And Hiwa spoke a little bit about this earlier, and wanting this, Ala is asking if we could hear a bit from She on how is this related to the experience of indigenous and ethnic minorities. Maybe we can start with She, and then if She also wants to add, and obviously Hiwa, if you want to elaborate more. Do you want me to repeat the question, Alina, so you can translate?
Sure, please.
Yeah, so the question is around the politics of body disposability and commodification of bodies, and how is this related to sort of the perspective and how this relates to indigenous and ethnic minorities, and perhaps She can talk a little bit about how this concept of politics of body disposability and commodification is being viewed or addressed in the communities that she works with.
Ok, She, tenemos una pregunta para ti. She, ¿estás ahí? She? Oh, I think
she dropped. So can I ask Sheena? Sheena, you're back, right? So was that? Can I ask you to perhaps address this question? And if not, then we can move to another question as well.
Yes, thank you. So sorry about that. I hope everyone can hear me, and I hope the internet doesn't sabotage my time here. When I dropped off, there was the first question asked by, I forget her name, I'm so sorry, but it was looking at state and protection, and I think it kind of ties into this thing in the same way, because in thinking about commodification and protection, right? So for instance, when a patriarchal state says that they want to protect your body, right? And that's why patriarchy works, because men are there to protect women. But what are they protecting us from if not them? If men really, or if patriarchy really, and protection of the territory of the body, and by and large the woman's body is if the idea was to protect the woman's body from harm, then they would do better in situations of extractive industries, right? And the kind of work that women do in different spaces, but it's actually controlling the sexuality and the sexual expression of women that's more a concern than the protection. So in this same narrative of controlling the sexuality and the sexual expression, or any kind of expression of women and women's bodies, comes in the idea of commodification, because this feeds right into this a neoliberal capitalist kind of situation where we are sold an idea of freedom, but it's only limited within these particular spaces. This is where you can be free, right? You can be free between this time and only doing that kind of thing. Your freedom is only limited to particular spaces. You're allowed to be free online, but only on XYZ forums. And this kind of idea of taking bodies, or if we agree that the body is an occupied territory, this the scramble and partitioning of as a territory. So state, as a culture, decide what is commodifiable, and something that's commodifiable means that it's going to be presented for profit, right? And sometimes it is in the way of labor. It is in the way, like Hiwa was speaking of, the trafficking of human bodies across spaces to go use these bodies for a particular economic gain. And so these conversations, which takes me right back to the beginning of what I was saying, need to be always addressed in that kind of a cyclic way, that ties things that are happening in the body as a territory to all these extraneous or seemingly external influences on the body as a territory, because we cannot talk about movement and talk about freedom and talk about autonomy without talking about the environment, without talking about the economy, without talking about all these other things that directly, just very directly influence the limiting of our bodily autonomy. Yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Sheena. Yes, you kind of also got to touch on the sort of building bridges and solidarity in touching on this last point on the interlinkages, not being able sort of breaking the silos, breaking away from just talking about one issue in terms of the body, the environment, the economics, and I think that's definitely one of the discussions that we should be having more and more of it, because it can't, like, the type of advocacy work that many of us do, it's really hard to just separate, I'm only working on sexuality, I'm only working on economic issues or environment. So it's really good for you to bring this back for us. I wanted to go back to another question from the audience. There was a question from give me a second, to Hiwa, more specifically on issues of militarization, and if it's coming from WeNet, and Hiwa, I hope you can hear me, so you can be able to answer this question. How would the issue of militarism and states, the use of state machinery in relation to policing women's bodies in particular ways? So the question is, how do we navigate space in highly militarized territories in ways that ensures our safety and security? Hiwa, are you there?
I am. Okay, I think there are many questions. I'm going to try to link them together. So basically, in terms of militarism, if we want to take militarization as such, first, the idea of militarization reinforces toxic masculinities, and the idea that masculinity is kind of masculinity in very normative ways is kind of the dominant power of society. So it links back to the body patriarch that we were talking about earlier. And so therefore, when we have this inequality, what happens is that weapons are used as tools that repress not only women's bodies, but also indigenous and marginalized populations. And what happens here in terms of what we can do about this whole geopolitical inequality that is embodied partly in militarization, but not only that, is to recognize militarization as a product of the neoliberal policies that the nation states are adopting, and it's kind of a race for militarization. And the second thing we can think about here is the relationship of militarization to resistance movements, because we often kind of bring the two together, confuse the two together, because there is armed resistance that sometimes are led by women, and so what we can do is not to see them as this homogeneous entity. And the third issue we can look at is geopolitical inequalities on the global level, because suddenly when a nation state is has increased militarization that happens to be in the global south, then suddenly it becomes related to religious fundamentalism and terrorism. I'm not saying it's not, but there is a kind of double standard in the way this is being perceived. And so in terms of the alternative, when we look at the alternative, and yes, there have been uprisings, there have been movements in MENA countries that kind of protested the status quo, I think it is important not to fetishize or idealize these movements, especially that they were not I mean, yes, they were movements of mass uprisings, but they were not necessarily led by feminist or progressive agendas. So while we might want to dismantle a certain fraction of the status quo, we might not want to dismantle militarization as a whole, for example. And this is where feminist intersectional politics come into play and become essential in the way we articulate our movements of solidarity and resistance on the ground.
Thank you, Hiwa. Sheena, I want to give you a chance to also add here if you'd like, because we also have another question for Hiwa, but I think both of you can touch on it as well. So we can either go now, or I can ask the other question, and you can have a choice.
Thanks so much, Marisa, and thank you so much, Hiwa. I just wanted to, I guess, add and try to make a more local context. Like, for instance, Kenya, or right now, I understand that the question comes from a sister in Zimbabwe. They are also such subtle, because when without knowing what militarization is, we see a very visible military presence, right? So there's increased, for instance, in Kenya, there's increased police presence, increased police brutality, actually, where there's a lot more police involvement in things that are really none of their business, and very brutal, and squashing of any kind of voices of dissent on any issue. It doesn't have to be a contentious women's rights issue, just protests which are allowed by the Kenyan constitution are squashed in very violent ways by a very, very militant police. But there's also very subtle militarism. There is, for instance, the mandatory pat-down searches when you're going into public shopping areas. So this has to happen to you. And in this space, this is an invasion of my body. I have not consented, but I need to access that supermarket. I need to access that shop. Therefore, I have to subject myself to a body search. In a situation where I am a gender non-conforming person, this does not apply. They will take me on face value. If they say you look like a man, I have to be searched by a man, at which point different kinds of violations will occur in that moment. And also, even like another nuance to this is in education, in schooling systems, in how companies are run. There is such an intense militarization of power, how power plays out, how decisions are made. These are things we grew up with. We grew up in very militant education systems where we had reporting structures that completely took away any kind of autonomy from you, and this is amongst the students to begin with. So every single space was policed, it was controlled, it was monitored, it was reported, it was punished. There were so many layers of militant presence, or there's a lot of militant presence in our lives, in every single thread that we live in, that we have to start being aware of. Like Hiwa said, there needs to be a conscious awareness of what is militant, what militancy means, how it presents and manifests in your immediate environment, and chances are it will. Immediately you will leave the house and you will see that you will have to respond or answer to a particular power structure that infringes on your right to movement and your bodily autonomy and integrity. So the nuance in militarism also needs to be considered and challenged where possible.
Thank you, Sheena. So I think we'll have time to address two more of the questions, and then we can and then we're going to come back to this question, the last question being the sort of the how do we actually then reclaim sort of the discussion around bodies and territories, and the solidarity that we need to, the bridges and solidarity that we need to advance to make that happen. But I'm going to, there's a question from Shireen Gokal, which is one of the organizers as well, which I think is interesting because it gets to sort of some of the issues that have already been raised around fundamentalisms and sort of monopolization, which is, Hiwa mentioned this specifically, but both Sheena and Hiwa can answer this as well. And that Hiwa mentioned the growth and rise of religious fundamentalisms, and because they provide an alternative for people, but why they did this uprising in different countries, regions, and the manner failed to gain momentum as an alternative to injustice and inequality. So this is a specific question for Hiwa, but I think, well, I'm thinking from my own context in Brazil and how the religious fundamentalism have actually been the sort of provider of services and of, I guess, for lack of better words, safety when the state fails. So it'd be good to hear some of your thoughts as well, Sheena, on this. Hiwa, do you want me to repeat the question, or are you good?
No, it's fine. I already answered that question, but I can elaborate. I tried to link it together with my previous answer. But basically, what I was saying is that we cannot see the mass uprisings as one homogeneous movement that took place at a certain period of time, mostly because they were spontaneous, huge uprisings. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but what I'm saying here is that we do not know, or we were not aware of the agendas that were being kind of, you know, brought up on the ground, that were sometimes conflicting agendas. And this is why I said that we should go back to the idea of intersectionality rather than, you know, dismantling one aspect of what is wrong with the state, which is, like, for example, a public figure. We should instead look at, you know, the ways many types of oppressions on bodily integrity and freedom intersect together to create a status of repression in certain nation states in certain contexts. Was there a second part for, did you want me to link it with another question?
No, let's see here from Sheena, and then I can ask the last question, or we see if others have questions as well.
Thanks, Marissa. I have to agree completely with Hiwa on this one. And in thinking about the Kenyan African context, the role that religious fundamentalisms play in restricting the attaining of our full bodily integrity is it's not very visibly political, right? But it's very visibly social. So it becomes a situation where the Kenyan Constitution says that women can now access abortion based on XYZ, and provides guidelines that says under XYZ circumstances women can access abortion, which is progressive, which is great. But the individuals who, for their own personal, spiritual, religious, moral reasons, decide that they don't think it's fair or it's okay for women to have access to abortion, refuse. And this is in the Ministry of Health. They refuse to publish these guidelines and hand them out, and to actually actively train and cause some kind of mandatory mind shift in people that allows women to access what is often life-saving sexual reproductive health and rights services. And that comes from a very social, cultural perspective, rather than it is the influence that we see that the church plays on, and mostly the church plays on influencing regressive policy for women. Unlike a country like Uganda, where the Anti-Homosexuality Act was was a very church, evangelical, charismatic church process, involving process. And so that's how it differs across the region. So religious fundamentalisms play a huge role, but they also still need to be interlinked in this particular context very closely to what's happening in the economy of that country and what geopolitical partnerships are happening, whereas then the religious aspect or the religious power takes a backseat to the money, because I find that, for instance, Kenyans, we are capitalists before we are Christians. In all honesty, we are about the money before we're about religion. And so if the religion is going to take away from our ability to completely absorb ourselves in capitalism, then we will allow religion to take a backseat, which I see differs from the South American situation.
Thank you, Sheena. I hope you guys can hear me. My internet disconnected for like a second, but then I came back. So unfortunately, we lost she completely lost connection. I haven't even been able to message her. So yeah, it's really unfortunate that she can't come back. And I think that's I guess some of both the privileges and the challenges of doing things like this, that we can have this kind of discussions, but then there are many people who are not able to connect or to participate. So we have a few more minutes, and I think I raised a question earlier around solidarity, and one of the participants also was raising the question of how do we there's a lot of factors that interact with bodily autonomy, and then we also talked a lot about the challenges ranging from militarism to sort of brutality, and Sheena spoke a bit about the reductionist approach when it comes to bodily autonomy and integrity and freedoms, and then sort of this we got into the commodification of bodies and monopoly of resources, and that's something that it seems is coming from all of the regions that we had present today. But then sort of I think the larger and really question that stood out for me was also this question around the geopolitical inequalities, which is both like sort of this, that has created these artificial, in some ways artificial, but also real boundaries on how do we address this, and sort of, and some of you mentioned the sort of the links also with colonization and sort of the colonization of the land and the body as well. But I was hoping that we could try to move and use the rest of the time that we have together to talk about how we actually reclaim where sort of the strategies that we have been using in our movements or different movements that you're part of on reclaiming the body in all its diversities and the links to the territory. And one of the questions that I thought was really good is from Dani Prado Castro around what frameworks can we use to begin to better understand bodily autonomy. And then I guess my addition to that question is like sort of what kind of bridges and solidarity do we need to continue to build and push for if we think about reclaiming bodies and territories, women's bodies and territories. Either Sheena or Hiwa can go. Maybe we can hear from Hiwa first and then Sheena.
Yeah, so to link to what I was saying earlier and to the question in terms of conflicting agendas, what happens with the movements is that I think one of the issues that we have, at least in the context I've been working in, is not being able to sustain certain movements that start or certain communities over a long period of time. But when we want to think about being able to reclaim bodily integrity and freedom and autonomy on the long term, then we need movements that are sustainable and that rely on that do not rely on people, but rather on the change that they are making on the ground. And at the same time, the problem with that, and to link it back to neoliberalism and capitalism, etc., is the issue that we face of NGOization. And so even within our movements, suddenly we become NGOized in the sense that we try to monopolize certain resources so that other people don't monopolize them. And what this has created is basically movements that are driven by where the money is going, to what end, to what project. So when the Syrian refugee crisis happened, suddenly all the money went to the Syrian refugees. And so queer, I'm not generalizing, but some queer organizations became more interested in like completely changing their projects towards Syrian gay refugees. And what happens here in terms of the NGOization is that we create an inequality. We become the middle person between where the resource is coming from and who it is going to. And this brings us back to the idea of solidarity, like how as feminist movements can we envision a solidarity that is based on solidarity but without assimilation. So I mean, it is very tricky to be able to sustain that on the long term, because our lives, our work depend on so many factors. But at the same time, being able to recognize that we cannot own other people's struggles, but we can stand in solidarity with them, we can be allies to them, and not resisting the urge to assimilate them into what we do on a daily basis, but rather be able to provide the space for them to grow their own movements. So this is why I would like to end with saying that we should look at many movements intersecting together on many different issues, rather than aiming for a big general movement that happens at a certain time and place and that has a certain expiry date, depending on the resources and the people that are working there.
Thank you, Hiwa. I will move to Sheena now.
Thank you, Hiwa and Marissa. I completely agree with Hiwa around building solidarity, and I'd like to quote Patricia Hill Collins's paper on Black feminist thought in the matrix of domination, which I feel offers a solution, or the beginning of a solution, in terms of building solidarity. And she says, and she's quoting Barbara Smith when she says, "What I really feel is radical is trying to make coalitions with people who are different from you. I feel it is radical to be dealing with race and sex and class and sexuality and sexual identity all at one time. I think that is really radical because it has never been done before." And so I feel they realize they are to what
Sheena, you're breaking up a lot, and I don't know if it's for me, but you're breaking up. Hello? Sheena?
Yeah.
You're back. Yeah, now it's better.
Is it better?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I'll just say Patricia Hill's quote again, just quickly, where she says that what I really feel is radical is trying to make coalitions with people who are different from you. I feel that it is radical to be dealing with race and sex and class and sexuality and sexual identity all at one time. I think that is really radical because it has never been done before. And I was saying that we really need to try to move away from identity politics, and not just in an LGBTIQA sense. Identity politics in terms of my identity as a Black lesbian poor, rural, indigenous, single mother, HIV positive, sex working woman? What do all these many oppressions that I carry every day, what do they mean when it comes to trying to find a way to make it stop? What is it? What is it about my oppressions that are similar to your oppressions? What is the issue? And the issue sometimes is not that I am a lesbian. The issue is heteronormativity and violence. And therefore the issue is violence. And therefore, how can we find ways to collaborate, to share? How can we find ways to collectively resist? How can we find ways to question? How can we find ways to come up with new ideas around how to not just transform messed up systems, but rather not just reform them, rather, but transform them entirely. Instead of trying to make patriarchy work for us, how can we just actually smash patriarchy? Because I find that we are in an almost survivalist mode as civil societies in terms of how do we just keep going, how do we keep existing in a space where resources, like Hiwa said, where the resources aren't there. How do we keep doing the work we're doing, but not lose sight of what the ideal is? What we want is bodily integrity. How do we keep the demand? How do we start the conversations that make people completely understand and internalize the language? So it's mostly through solidarity work, coalition building, conversations, ideas, and resistance that I think we have to start creating a space for shifting things around. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you both. This is really great. I have to be honest that I'm like on the edge of my seat because I'm so excited with some of the final thoughts and how we're wrapping this up and actually looking at what has been done and coming from sort of the most localized context of how we take this this forward. And I think it's really exciting because obviously we know when we deal with the repressions and the challenges, but often we forget to talk about what is actually working and how we need to change these things. And I think we both of you did a great job in framing this for us and going forward. And this is exactly what we hope to make. It's to create these conversations that are hard conversations to have, but that needs to be had when it's sort of the how do we build coalition if we're not talking to each other, not at each other, but how we actually break down some of the challenges that we have and the different approaches that we are using in our own context. And this is one of the objectives of the goal, to have this this first webinar series, which will hope to continue to have the conversations towards the AWID farm, but not to stop there, because this is a continuation of the process. So I'm just really grateful for all of the speakers who were able to make the time and to be here with us. I just want to check if we have any last minute questions before we do a little bit of sort of closing in terms of the way forward with this. But it seems like we're okay, no major questions. I wonder if anyone from the organizers want to add anything. And Rupsa, yeah, so I actually will give it to Rupsa now to give us a sense of what we're going forward with the next webinar and give everyone the dates and what we have looking forward to. Rupsa, are you there? Can you?
Yes.
There you are.
Yes, I'm there. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, thank you, Marissa. That was an excellent webinar. I was coming in and out, but anyway, thank you to all the speakers as well. I just wanted to do a quick update about the next webinar that we are planning. It's scheduled for 17th August, and the focus of this conversation, the second webinar, is going to be on liberty rights, trans and intersex activists I think this group of us who worked together in putting together some of the processes leading up to the umbrella session at the AWID Forum on bodily integrity and freedoms felt very strongly that, and I think some of those points came out very strongly today. I really liked what Kia said about how we couldn't own other people's struggles, but really how do we stand in solidarity with other movements, become allies, genuine allies, what Sheena talked about, an intersectional rather than a very narrow identity-based politics. And I think our second webinar really wants to kind of take us in the direction of that conversation, build on some of the things that came out so powerfully from the speakers today. We're going to be putting up the details of the webinar. We're also going to be making an effort to use a different platform so that people with disabilities can have more access. So look out for the space that we've created. More information will be coming soon.
Thank you, Rupsa. And also, I haven't checked Twitter, but we are hoping to use the hashtags and see if we can build some sort of collection of the thoughts that will coming out of the webinar today and the discussion, so that we can, as I said, that we can have we continue this conversation. If not to the webinar, we'll have the discussion again in a few weeks, but then also the AWID forum. And one of the other things that's really linked to this exercise for us is the call for poster that Kriya has sent out on bodily integrity and freedoms, and the deadline is August 15. So I encourage everyone to submit your posters. It doesn't have to necessarily be new work, but work that you want to share. So please do submit, and we'll send again the link. So it is on the Google Hangout page. So check that out and do send us your inputs. And we'll be showcasing those that are selected at the AWID forum, and thinking about how we can disseminate and use it going forward to show the different works and the arts that are involved with the artivism as well. So I think that's it from our side. We'll be in touch. Hopefully we can put something together that we can share with everyone, but very grateful that for everybody who joined today, for the speakers, and for everybody that had to deal with the technological challenges. But overall, we need to experiment, so this was definitely an experimentation for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, my camera's on and off, but it's good to see everyone in the end. Sheena's there. Well, thank you so much. We'll all be connected somehow.